is a fellow and vice president at Sun Labs and is also Sun Microsystems Chief Security Officer. He was a co-inventor with Martin Hillman of public key cryptography, which work he did back in 76 to 78. That was quoted as the most revolutionary new concept in the field since the Renaissance. Now, that's a pretty good achievement, and that was by David Kahn, historian of communication intelligence and code breaking, excuse me. Witt is a passionate critic of public policy on cryptography and other public policies. He and Susan Landau co-authored a really wonderful book called Privacy on the Line, which was published in 1998. And if you haven't read it, do. Witt grew up in Queens in New York, and in the 5th grade at the New York Public Library, he read every single book on cryptography except for one. So hopefully tonight we'll get to find out which book he didn't read. Plus, I also want to know how many books on cryptography were actually in the City College Library. In 1965, he received his, how many? He received his Bachelor of Science from MIT, so apparently some of you are keyed in on that one. In 1966, as a MITRE employee, he wrote a Lisp compiler at the MIT AI lab and worked with an incredible set of hackers, which he might tell us about. In 1969, he was hired by John McCarthy at the Stanford AI lab to work on proof of correctness of programs. And from 1973 to 1974, he spent time working in various organizations working on cryptography. In 1974, he joined Martin Hillman at Stanford. In 78, he became the manager of secure systems research at Northern Telecom. I actually think that's the first place we may have met. And in 1991, he joined Sun Labs. In 1992, he received his doctorate in technical science from the Swiss Federation Institute of Technology. Witt has received a large number of awards. He's a fellow in the Marconi Foundation. He's a fellow at the International Association for Cryptographic Research. He's won awards from another of my favorite organizations, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He received the joint award between NIST and the National Security Agency, and you know what those folks do. And he received the Levy Prize from the Franklin Institute. So I could go on more, but I won't. So with that, Witt? Where is Witt?
Thanks very much. Well, let me start with a piece of housekeeping. I give the Computer Museum and anyone else the right to record this talk under the conditions of copyleft. If you are viewing the talk in any medium, you are entitled to copy it, and you're entitled to give the copies to anyone you like under the same conditions. So, that said, I think the answer that Glenn Edens wanted is around 6. What exactly happened is that my 5th grade teacher did a half a day on cryptography, and I got interested in the subject. And I asked my father, who taught at City College, what he could find. And in fact, he didn't bring all the books because I discovered one later, a rare one that they owned, not old, World War II sort of ad hoc course text. But in any event, roughly speaking, I was able to read all the kids' books, and I wasn't able to read Helen Gaines' book, Cryptanalysis, and I haven't read it yet. Now, what I'm going to try to do tonight is risky. Doesn't risk anything more than being a flop, but what I'm going to do is talk a lot about my personal experiences working in the subject, but I'm also going to try to do it in the context of the flow of information security in the 20th century and into the 21st. So I'm going to start talking about generalities, and then I'm going to talk about a lot of concrete experiences, and then I'm going to go back to talking about some some generalities. So it's the opposite of an hourglass figure. I don't know what you'd call this subject. Well, they told me it would advance the slides. Oh, maybe I'm pressing the wrong. No, I'm not. I'm pressing the right thing. Hey! What do you know? Okay. I know what's wrong. When I was practicing, I had no idea what the order of the slides was, so I was pushing it through. Cryptography is at least 500 years old, right? You know that I did the most revolutionary thing since the Renaissance. In fact, cryptography as we know it today dates from the Renaissance, in a certain sense, in mathematical sense. It probably goes back a couple of thousand years before that. But the really critical notion, what do we got here? Nah, that's no good. The really critical notion developed during the Renaissance is the distinction between a cryptographic system and a cryptographic key. So before that, basically, systems were so simple this distinction was hard to make. If you think about working with a code book, right? The code book is the key. The cryptographic system is oppressively simple. You know, look the plain text up in the code book, find the corresponding ciphertext, write down the ciphertext, right? And go to the next bit. The trouble with that, of course, is that all the expense is in making up the code book. And the code book has to be secret. So you put all the expense into making up the secret piece. And what became possible after what was seen in the Renaissance, which are called polyalphabetic systems, was that you could put all the engineering effort into the public piece. And then you could make the secret piece very cheap. And that really is the whole, thing that dominates thinking about contemporary cryptography. Now, cryptography, what did I say there? 1903. In the fall of 1903 was the first transatlantic radio transmission. And that changed everything in communications, and in particular, it changed everything in communications security. There's a certain amount of prehistory with telegraphs and things like that. But in essence, before radio, things were secured, via the diplomatic bag or the envelope in the mail or the trusted courier. It was the channel that was used for protection. Once you got radio, right, radio was truly wonderful. If you look, the first Sea Lord commanded the greatest fleet in the world and had no idea where it was. Within a few years after radio, the first Sea Lord could reach any ship within a day. And now, of course, it's just like making any other phone call. The Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Navy, First Sea Lord can reach their ships except for a few submarines immediately. So radio was of inestimable value. Nobody could ignore it. And the trouble with it was everybody could listen to the radio. All of a sudden, there were no ancillary security measures there. You had nothing to rely on except cryptography. Right? Now, it's important to look at exactly what problem they were solving. And I want to take note of this because I'm going to talk about how the problems have changed over time. Now, let's go through this one. First place, if you're thinking about military cryptography, certainly as it existed then, you are thinking of a moderately coherent organization. It has a chain of authority. The people in one side, one army, all have pretty much the same objectives. Two, it's all about communication. Essentially, there was no computation then, right? So we're talking then, you could call it, and it was called communication security at that time. The term information security is a decade or two or three old and dates from after computers appear. It was mostly a matter of confidentiality. It's not that authenticity wasn't important, and those are the two big objectives of information security, is to decide, keep something confidential and to be sure it's really what you wanted, that it comes from the person you wanted, that it hasn't been altered. But if you're thinking about human beings talking on the radio, or communicating by telegraph, there are a whole lot of things, from tone of voice to telegraph fist, that serve for the authentication. It was hard to impersonate people. On the other hand, since the radius of interception is so large, it's very easy to record traffic and to make use of it, communications intelligence. So confidentiality was the problem that dominated cryptography at that era. You're talking about state-level actors. You're talking about people who can spend millions of dollars, can put up antennas over distances of thousands of miles. They're not restrained by law. So you can't sue somebody for having listened to your communications. And if you look at the failures, the first thing about them is they're pretty hard to detect. Right? One of the big things in information intelligence is that you get really good at concealing how you learn things. So when you blow up some ship, you have some cover story that comes out about how you found out it was going to be there. And often those cover stories are lies. They found it out through signals intelligence. But they managed to conceal that fact. I was at the International Association for Chiefs of Police a few years ago, and they had a wonderful account of how some drug dealer on the West Coast named something like Zebra was busted. And they went through how they concealed. Remember, they're working with search warrants and things, and they want to keep the search warrant going and avoid blowing their cover. And some guy, they knew from the taps that he had his pickup truck all full of dope. Right? And he was packing it in coffee grounds because that's how the customer wanted it. Don't ask. And he drives down, he runs out of coffee, so he drives down to the local shopping center to buy more coffee. He was busted for low axle. Right? The thing's, got a ton of dope in it. And that makes it natural for him to pull back and say, hey, what's in this thing anyway? Well, that's the kind of way that communications intelligence operates. So it may be very hard to detect that you've had a communications and security failure, and in wartime conditions, there are lots of times that there's no way of recovering. As I said, there's no chance to sue somebody, right? So, you lose a message, lose a battle, something like that. You have to go on to the next act. So, I've been talking about it for a moment. I guess I really have by this point said what cryptography is. It's a mechanism of transforming messages, transforming bodies of data, so that only people who know certain secret keys can do anything with it. And I won't go into it any farther, I think, tonight. So, what was the world's response to the phenomenon of the First World War? I mean, what it did was it swamped the code clerks. I mean, they were operating entirely by hand, mostly looking things up in code books, though there are some other more foresighted systems, like the German ADF GVX system. And immediately during the First World War and immediately after, a whole bunch of people began to work on mechanical and electromechanical cryptographic machines. And one could easily spend more than an hour on that subject. I won't say much about them tonight. But what the interesting point is that what they do is they automate the techniques that go back 500 years. They really involve two things. One is some kind of an arithmetic operation. Addition modulo n was the typical one there. And the other is table lookups. Right? So you have index registers and tables, to use computer science terms. And that, in some sense, that is all of non-public key cryptography today. And I'll say probably a few more words about that. Now, what it turned out, that's the first step. Right? The second point is that this is all about secret keys. If you can't keep the keys secret, that is to say, if you can't manufacture keys in such a way that your opponents can't figure out what they are, you're cooked. It doesn't matter what the cryptographic system is. The opponent knows the keys. The opponent can read the traffic also. So it turned out that a very large part of this problem is a problem of key management, and that within a centrally structured organization, it is possible to do that in a rather satisfactory way. It takes a lot of attention to detail. Right? But if you take the United States as the example, look at the Department of Defense. It's a very large organization. At times it employs more than 1 million people. But it's a very centralized organization. Everybody knows the chain of command. From the President, to the Secretary of Defense, to the Joint Chiefs, to the 4-star generals, and on down. And this organization, therefore, it appoints an executive agent for communication security. That's the National Security Agency. And this executive agency has a large activity called the Central Facility. And the Central Facility manufactures keys. It's mostly electronic now, but it used to claim to have the largest printing press in the world. Right? And it's shipping out tons of keying material every day that filters out through staging areas and into the commands, and it has expiration dates on it, and it's in tamper-resistant wrappers and all sorts of stuff. A very expensive thing. But the bottom line is that if you can manufacture good key, you can have good cryptography. You don't have to actually have, if you manufacture enough key, you don't need any machines, you just sort of add it to the plain text. It's called one-time material. And building these structures, in fact, took up, in information security, that is the dominant problem of the 20th century. So, first with electromechanical machines, then after the Second World War with the purely electronic machines, a whole lot of development of discrete mathematics, a whole lot of development of the bureaucratic machinery, a whole lot of development of the random number technology. Right? Okay. Get to the 1970s and I'll begin talking in personal terms. I wanted to give you a sense of what the problem was as it stood then. And notice I've said several times, I've talked several times about rather coherent organizations, organizations with an understood authority structure and an understood chain of command. Well, I'm 60 years old. In the 1970s, I was a young radical. I didn't see the world that way. And I had, as a matter of 1965, a friend named Bill Mann who told me mistakenly that NSA encrypted the telephones within its own building. Now, that isn't true. I mean, what they actually do is they did at the time in the event, run the secure phones in shielded conduits, just have two telephone systems. But I began worrying myself sick about how could you do this? And how could you get benefit out of it? I understood you could encrypt everything with the same key, but to my way of thinking, that wouldn't give you security because I thought about protecting yourself against the person in the next office. Right? That's not all the way a bureaucrat is, I mean, I could have said the same thing about locking the doors or having the fence. Right? That doesn't protect them from each other. In fact, they trust each other. So I began pondering I began basically pondering the problem of key management. I hadn't thought about it before. Then in 1969, just 35 years ago, 35 years and a month or so ago, I moved here, and John McCarthy, my boss, had just gone to, I think, Marseille, to give a talk on the paperless office and on what he called, I remember the phrase, buying and selling through home terminals, right? What we now call internet commerce. And I began thinking about the paperless office, and what I focused on was, what would you do to replace the written signature? So I now had two problems I was worrying about. Well, what I was working on for John McCarthy, incidentally, is I wasn't thinking of it in security terms at the time, but it's a very big security problem. I was working on proof of correctness of programs, which I thought then and probably still think is the most important problem in contemporary engineering. I merely discovered that cryptography was an easier way to make a living. And I had, very much security-like fantasies of this. I imagined, I wanted to prove the correctness of programs for an automated space station, Reed Airport or air traffic control system, something of that kind. Well, in the summer of 1972, NSA did me the first of a number of great favors. Larry Roberts, who was our funder at ARPA, was supporting, he's the one who supported time sharing and all sorts of stuff, artificial intelligence. He went to Howard Rosenblum, who was the deputy director of NSA for communication security, and he said, we need help with security on the ARPANET. So Major, this is a prototype military communication system. We have no security on it. We need to get thinking about that. But the trouble is the two men, both of great foresight, couldn't come to a deal because I'm not sure what my next slide is my problem. I don't want to see that yet. You're getting the benefits of a freshly prepared talk. It isn't very well rehearsed. Larry Roberts didn't want to support any secret work, and Howard Rosenblum didn't want to do any unclassified work, right? And so the whole thing hung up for the moment. Curiously enough, that all changed. It didn't, I guess, they both backed down a bit And 2 years later, 75 or so, BBN was developing something called the private line interface, which was all of it sort of, I don't know, the documents aren't labeled, the early ones, but it would be what was called, for official use only, and it used KG34s, and that piece of it was secret, so forth. But summer of 72, they couldn't come to a deal, so Roberts did what he did when he was interested in a new problem. He began talking to his principal investigators. One of those was my boss, John McCarthy. And McCarthy went to Washington, he talked to Roberts, Roberts talked about network security. McCarthy came back, he began talking to his researchers, and we focused in on the cryptographic aspect of this. This probably, this isn't what Rosenblum, in fact, when he began working on the subject, had in mind. He knew a lot about cryptography already, began working on what we now call security protocols. But at the AI lab, several of us began thinking on cryptography, and the others, John McCarthy and some other people, stopped fairly quickly, and I kept on. And by the spring of 1973, I was thinking about nothing else. And John McCarthy was fed all the way up to his back teeth because he had a problem. And the problem was that I was being supported under the table by NSA to do the work on proof of correctness. So he could hardly write in his progress report, Diffie is working on cryptography. His customer wouldn't have liked that one. So we came to a parting of the ways. I took an indefinite leave of absence. To my surprise, a year or so ago, later it turned out to be terminal. They sent me the rest of my pay and said so long. But I took off indefinitely, an unpaid leave, and began traveling. And I originally intended to travel around the world, but I got as far as New Jersey and made my first discovery, whom I'd like to introduce. That's Mary Fisher, my wife. I don't think without that I would have discovered anything else. And I spent this time, it was sort of three things. Looking for anybody who wanted to talk. I was thinking about the subject and looking for anybody who was interested in talking about the subject, and looking for cryptographic literature was a little hard to find in those days. And I was, actually it turned out there was some. In particular, that spring, Horst Feistel, who's one of the most influential and in many ways not adequately acknowledged, as much acknowledgement as he gets, it isn't enough. Horst Feistel had published an article in Scientific American on principles of modern cryptography. And if you read that article now, you will see that design methodology in things including the advanced encryption standard I'll get to. But so, first I traveled alone, then we traveled together. We came back here in the fall of the year and lived through the winter here and went back to the East Coast to pick up Mary's things and so forth in 74. And we went to visit the cryptographic laboratory at IBM in Yorktown Heights. That was the only significant non-governmental cryptographic laboratory at the time. And we met a man named Alan Conheim, who was the head of that group. And Conheim was very secretive. He didn't tell me very much. All he said was, I can't tell you about what we're doing. We're under a secrecy order. But you really should go look up my old friend Marty Hellman. He's out at Stanford, and when you get back there, look him up. Two people can work on a problem better than one. Right? So he wished he'd never said that, because I looked up Marty Hellman. It was a marriage made in heaven. I mean, we were each the most informed person willing to talk about cryptography the other had met. Right? His mother-in-law is a dog breeder. Mary can recognize 300 breeds of dog at a glance. We started out with a half-hour meeting scheduled for 4 in the afternoon, and we finally all parted company after dinner around 11 at night. And I worked with Marty for, roughly speaking, 5 years, during a lot of which time I was technically a graduate student at Stanford University. In that time, I managed to take 4 courses and write 4 papers. And the alumni register politely shows me as having graduated in 1978. That's when they lost track of me. They found me again, and it appears my mailbox will never be empty. Now, so I had these 2 problems I've been thinking about, remember? One is a problem of key management. You're imagining you have a community, and I'm thinking of this community not as being coherent, not of all trusting each other and wanting to communicate among themselves, but of wanting to communicate securely, say, in pairs. And my vision of this was a secure telephone system for all of North America. 100 million secure telephones. We aren't there yet, incidentally. And that meant, loosely speaking, the square of that number, right? 10 to the 8th, 10 to the 16th keys somehow have to be managed. I had that problem. And at the same time, I'd been thinking about this problem of digital signature. And I couldn't figure out how to solve that one either. What I really, of course, had set out to work on cryptography, I was after a whole lot of stuff that subsequently I think other people have done much more with than I have, which has to do with discrete mathematics and theories of approximation and proofs of security and reductions of crypto systems to other crypto systems, things of that kind. But spring of '75, I was also on the side thinking, I had this little list growing of what I called problems for an ambitious theory of cryptography. And one of them I came to, I wanted to run two things together. One was the Unix password security mechanism. So passwords are encrypted so that the password file isn't secret. As a managerial matter, that is an infinite benefit. You can pass the password system around, password table around, quite freely. We don't do it as freely as we used to, but at least the system administrators can pass it around. They don't have to handle it as the biggest secret in the world. The other thing is now much better known than it was then, but at the time it was known in one form. And incidentally, it's what got Horst Feistel into this. It's called identification friend or foe. When a military fire control radar is looking at an aircraft, it says, you know, prove to me that you're a friend of mine and I shouldn't shoot at you. And the way basically it does it is, it sends an encrypted message and expects it to be decrypted, altered, and re-encrypted in the right way. So when it's coming back, it decrypts it and checks to see if it has the right relationship to the original message. Now that protects you against something different. That protects you against, in the modern terminology, shoulder surfing. Okay? So, I mean, and today you would say, you know, if you look at a little Enigma card or something, I forgot to bring mine out of my basket. You have something that will answer, you get sent a challenge by a system you're logging into, and you type the challenge into a little card, and it shows you an answer, and you send back the answer. That's the same thing that the IFF, Mark 12 IFF system does. So I had these two problems, and at the time, I was living off my wife. She was working for Pacific Petroleum, and I had another boon. John McCarthy had left town. He'd gone to Japan, and he'd left us to watch his daughter Sarah. You know, I mean, she's perfectly capable of taking care of herself, except for the fact that you can't drive in California. You're going to starve, so somebody had to drive her around. And I had John's, at the time, sumptuous working facilities available to me. That is, he had a home terminal with a 5 kilobit connection to the artificial intelligence lab. This seemed luxurious. And so I, you know, between housekeeping and cooking, a lot of what I did, I was thinking about these problems, and one afternoon it occurred to me that I thought I saw how to solve the problem of signatures, and that didn't impress me too much. A few days later, it came back to mind, and I saw that you could turn it around and get it to solve the problem of key distribution. And immediately, I've lost the date this happened because I was keeping my diary of this work on the computer, and I recognized this was really valuable. And I knew that the computer wasn't secure, so I didn't put this in there. It may be on some piece of paper somewhere, but I don't know precisely where. So I walked downhill to Marty Hellman's house. Well, first Mary came home. I explained it to her. We had dinner. After dinner, I walked downhill, and it took me probably an hour to explain it to Marty Hellman. It took at the time, it's fascinating. Now I can make people believe in it very quickly because we know it can be done. But at the time when it was just an idea, it was very hard to persuade people of it. The one person who really understood it instantly was John McCarthy. He wasn't back for another couple of months, but he just, the instant I explained it to him, he understood it. Some other people may have understood it, but they were covering up, it turns out. We'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so had this idea. Won't have time to go through, when you're worried, it's interesting to look at the sort of false starts and the unclarity of thought and so forth. But roughly speaking, it goes as follows, that Marty and I began working on this subject, and we wrote two things simultaneously. One is a paper that appeared under the name New Directions in Cryptography. I died off for lack of something. What we got next? We got, oh, no, wrong way. Yeah, okay. One is a paper called New Directions Cryptography, and the other was a paper that was given at the National Computer Conference in June of 1976. So what we developed between the time that that paper was submitted and the time it appeared, and what went into that talk and into New Directions, is this scheme. Now, I have two analogies for this. One is, what do you call that stuff the truckers used to do? CB radio. I don't know if people still do that or not. But imagine you're running down the highway and saying, testing, 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 or something like that. You get in touch with somebody, and what you want to talk to them about is, where the police are or something, because you're both driving 90. But you know that the police are listening to this channel also. So you figure, that if you tell everybody where their radar trap is, they'll just move it a few miles. And so when you get hold of somebody, you say, give me your cell phone number. And then you make a call to that person on a cell phone. Well, now look at this from the point of view of the police. The police are driving around, they have their cars, they have their radios, they have cell phones, but the fact that you make, they don't have equipment for intercepting cell phone calls. So by translating this, by moving this, by negotiating over the CB channel to make a cell phone call, you've moved it off into the cell phone domain where they can't get hold of it. Another way to look at this, and I'm going to explain this in an instant, another way to look at this is as bridge bidding. Now, if you think about it in bridge, you and your partner each know one aspect of something. You know one hand, your partner knows the other hand. You're sort of bidding about the joint hand. The other two, north, south, or east, west, or whatever they are, don't know about either of your hands, so they know less than you do. Well, this is pushed to the limit. This is an example of that. This is a matter of two people negotiating in public. Everything said and heard is seen. But at the end of the negotiation, the negotiators know a secret that the observers don't know. And the critical one, the wonderful thing about this is it turns on exceedingly elementary mathematics. Right? So it'll work in lots of groups, but just think about it in arithmetic mod p. That being what a clock does. You get to 12 and you start over with 1. Or we would usually in mathematics, we'd say you get to 11, you start over with 0. And each party here makes up a secret. Right? Each one sends out something related to the secret. So g to the power x mod p, technical jargon, g is what's called a generator over a group mod p. As I say, that's all a technicality. It'll work in lots of groups. And then each of them does a different calculation. But because of the way exponents work in these groups, they end up with the same result. Somebody who doesn't know either x or y is believed, I want to say this carefully because in fact the exact reduction results are rather tricky. But wide experience makes us believe that a person who doesn't know either x or y has a vastly harder problem learning g to the xy than somebody who knows one or the other. Now that's one way of doing public key cryptography. In fact, that's not the way I originally conceived of it. This is the way Ralph Merkle originally conceived of it, and Ralph was a graduate student at the University of California at Berkeley, and he wrote a term paper about this, and Lance Hoffman, his professor, didn't understand it, and Merkle dropped the course, and then Merkle, through a guy named Peter Blattman, found us, and sent an incomprehensible paper to Marty and made a slightly more comprehensible phone call to me, and we took what Merkle had done and produced a solution to it in a different way. The other way of doing it is very much like a letterbox or a night depository. Right? It's a way that somebody can put a message in and only one person can get a message out. And that depends on slightly more complex arithmetic. I'm not going to discuss it tonight. The one real solution, good solution that's been found for that approach has become, I think largely because since it was solved the problem the way I conceived it, I promoted it as much as I could, and it has become the most common public key system. That's called RSA, after Ron Rivest, Adi Shamir, and Len Edelman. And I think what I have next is a bunch of pictures. So it's then and now pictures. That's Ralph Merkel, Marty Hellman, and me as ragamuffins in it says 77. I'm surprised it's that late, but 77, 76, something like that. This is how we're alleged to look now, but I happen to know that that picture was taken about 10 years ago. And I don't know whether, I don't know whether I look worse or not, but the critical point is lots of pictures have been taken of me since, but somehow whenever Sun looks in its archives, they always come up with that picture. That's a picture of Marty Hellman. I don't know when either of these pictures was taken. They're clearly more recent, but I don't know the exact dates. This is the MIT trio. This is Adi Shamir, who's now at the Weizmann Institute, Ron Rivest, who's still at MIT, and Len Edelman, who's at the University of Southern California. And I haven't got the time tonight to go into the tales of their discovery. This one's backwards, apparently. That must be the way they look kind of recently. That's the way they looked back then. God, what a bunch of dorks. Now, we have actually, somewhat later, about 1980, 81, I discovered some more people who'd worked on this, and they eventually, their organization went public in 1997. These guys are all from GCHQ in Britain. James Ellis died in late 1997, and immediately, within a month or so, his organization went public with his work. He roughly plays the role cognate to me, that is to say that he had the idea of public key. Exactly why is not clear. His papers are exceedingly unclear to me, and unfortunately, although I talked to him many times, I didn't see the papers till after he died, so I couldn't question him in detail about the way he said things in the papers. So GCHQ now makes out that they discovered this for the obvious purpose to solve the problems of key distribution, but there's every evidence that, that they didn't understand that aspect of it. And I would like to give a talk around here sometime on the subject. I've given a talk at NSA and a talk at the University of London about how to sort out the relationships of these discoveries. The second one there is Clifford Cox, still at GCHQ. Now I think he has the job, it's called HR, the curious name for us, right? But that's, the H is, he's the senior mathematician. And I'm trying to think, Sean Wiley, various well-known mathematicians have held this job. Clifford Cox did something truly remarkable. I'm very impressed with RSA. From the time they read our paper in January 77 to about March, they produced that system. I thought that was pretty good. Clifford Cox came up with essentially the same system in about 6 or 8 hours. He'd been hired by GCHQ. He didn't have a clearance yet. Malcolm Williamson, who'd hired him, I think they were old school buddies, gave him something to think about, and that stuff wasn't very secret, so he told him that, and Cliff went back to his boarding house and worked on this, and by midnight he'd come up with this system. Malcolm Williamson is analogous to Marty and me. He developed something essentially the same thing as Diffie-Hellman. The interesting point, this work is late 69. I think that's 73. Williamson is after our work. It's published, it was published, in their sense of publication, internal secret memo to file, in August of 76, about 2 months after I'd presented it at the National Computer Conference. I don't accuse them of plagiarism. I think they were so narrow that they probably didn't go to the National Computer Conference. It's also evidence of linear response. There were 6 of us in the U.S. We worked on this for had the same results in 3 years. There were 3 of them that had the results in 6 years. So, 9 pregnant women, it really, works pretty well. So, I skip forward for a little bit, being the slave of my slides, and just say, we went through the 80s developing these things. Right? It didn't come about as a market matter the way I originally anticipated. I thought in terms of telephones. In fact, there was a major secure telephone project in the 1980s. It's called the STU-3, the third generation secure telephone. NSA finally recognized the utility of these concepts and built a telephone system based on them, of which there are about 500,000. And it's interesting to me, I won't say much about this right now, but the critical point is, this was a great project in its time. In the 1980s, a telephone was electronic office communication. Right? Today, the problem is not that these secure telephones aren't still secure, don't work fine, etc. It's that, of course, now you have, what's in your office? Your telephone, Ethernet, ISDN, pager, cell phone, fax. It's all diversified around, and diversified around the solution. And I think you'll find that widely characteristic of security problems. So, skipping, into the 90s, I spent the 90s, I took my job description very seriously when I got to Sun. They told me I was a distinguished engineer, and the mandate of a distinguished engineer was to work on whatever within the scope of the company's work seemed the most, important. And what I decided roughly in 1992 was that the political aspects of security were the most important things, and I spent the whole decade working on politics. And Mary Holzer's kindly put together a bunch of slides of this. That one's I know was talking at the White House after a meeting the 15th of February 2000. There'd been a big denial of service attack on the internet, and the president needed to show that he was concerned, so he invited a bunch of us in. I assume that's testifying to somebody, but I don't know where. Okay, so where are we today? We spent most of the 20th century working on cryptography. I won't say anything much tonight about computer security, but in fact the last third of the century, a great deal of information security work was in sort of technical issues of computer operating system security, and that's all still being sorted out. So, cryptography is now far and away the best settled part of information security. That hasn't sunk into everybody yet. Right? You're constantly getting, like say companies like Tristrata that are they're based on some new cryptographic concept because they're acutely aware of the Second World War situation in which cryptographic systems were constantly being broken. Cryptography itself has now sedimented down into a matter of standardization, and the single most remarkable success tale, I think, there is the U.S. Advanced Encryption Standard. In 1975, there was proposed, in 77, there was adopted Federal Information Processing Standard 46, which was called the Data Encryption Standard, and was intended for all U.S. government information that needed protection, but was not covered under existing laws and entitled to the protection used for classified information. And that standard was designed to be just strong enough for its purpose, but not strong enough that if there were some real need for the intelligence agencies to break the traffic, that they couldn't do it. Now, I don't know whether that objective was achieved, but it's probably within a factor of 1,000 to 1,000,000 one way or the other of calibrated right. By the early 1990s, it was perfectly clear it was no longer anywhere close to adequate. John Gilmore, who was Sun employee number 5 and was one of the founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, went and built a $250,000 machine in the early 90s that could extract DES keys in about a week. And things went all the way downhill from there. Late 90s, by some not yet to me entirely understood change of policies, National Institute for Standards and Technology initiated and got away with a program to develop a replacement standard that had no similarity of objectives. It was designed from the beginning, one, very publicly, and two, to be as strong as anybody could want. So it is a 128-bit block cipher, and I apologize, I won't explain all the jargon. You can turn to the cryptographer in the seat next to you if you're not up on this stuff. That supported 128-bit, that is billion, 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 billion number of keys, 192-bit, and 256-bit keys. But even more remarkable to my mind is the fact that the algorithm that was chosen, they held a big contest and they had 15 submissions from all over the world. And the US picked as its national standard an algorithm designed in Belgium. It was, despite 9/11, it was confirmed, I think it's November 26, 2001, could be October, as Federal Information Processing Standard 197. And then it took another 2 years, but to add to this surprise, the Committee on National Security Systems of the Pentagon, that is the people who authorize the protection of classified information, issued a memo called CNSS 15, which they tastefully declared to be for official use only, but then they issued a press release that's about 90% the same words. They approved it for the protection of classified information at all levels. So to speak, publicly acknowledging its strength. That's a matter of principle so far, incidentally. I'm not aware of any fielded equipment yet that uses it for classified traffic, but Harris told me at a trade show last spring that they had built a chip. As a matter of fact, they claimed to show me the chip, but they also said it was still coming back from the fab, so I was not sure I'd really seen it. But you know how people are at trade shows. The other big thing in contemporary cryptography is what's called elliptic curve cryptography, second generation public key cryptography. It is all of the Diffie-Hellman, and I haven't mentioned Taher el-Gamal, but in terms of signatures, it turns out there's a way of using the Diffie-Hellman type arithmetic to give you signatures. As a matter of fact, it's the basis of the U.S. signature system, which is due to Taher el-Gamal, who was at Stanford and now has a business called Securify around here. Those techniques of that kind can be done in quite a number of groups, and 15 years ago, roughly speaking, 18 maybe by now, Neil Koblitz of the University of Washington and Victor Miller of IBM, essentially simultaneously independently, proposed what's called elliptic curve cryptosystems. And these bring the sizes of things down into reasonable ranges. Today, if you're very paranoid and you're using Diffie-Hellman in its original form, RSA, you need at least 1,000, preferably 2,000 or 3,000 bits. And so people talk about a lot more than that. Elliptic curve cryptography brings the numbers down to about twice the sizes of the conventional keys. So for 128-bit conventional keys, the corresponding key distribution mechanism needs 256-bit keys. That makes them faster, and NSA said to us, very hush-hush, that they were going to shift to 1905, 2007, something like that. And then they said it under their breath at the annual meeting on elliptic curve cryptography, and the word got around a bit. So sometime later in the decade, they're planning to switch a lot of their operations. The third big component are what are called hash functions, and I won't say a lot about that. We have the whole string of them that are U.S. standards. Some of you will know that this one, which was decommissioned and replaced by that one about 5 years ago, but this one was broken at the CryptoCon paper presented in the Rump session by a woman named, I think, Chan, last summer at Crypto. And the wonderful thing about this break was that they took their definition of SHA-0 out of Schneier's book, Applied Cryptography. And one of the constants was wrong. Right? So they hadn't really, when she told people about this, they hadn't really done it. But the Rump session was the next day, and she phoned back to Beijing, and her colleagues ran the program again, but the next day they had a few examples with the corrected case, so it was perfectly clear they could do it in one day. They really had broken it. They hadn't put a lot more work into it than they said they had. Full details have not yet been published as far as I know. So, in cryptography, it's interesting, public key cryptography, I think, has made the use of cryptography in very diverse, what's going on here? There we go, okay, we'll get to that. Has made the use of cryptography in much more diverse communities possible. That does not exactly make it easy. And the big logistic problem, public key cryptography leads to something called public key infrastructure, which is entirely analogous to this tree-structured central facility and staging areas and things like that. But nobody, for many reasons that are a combination of technical, political, really largely business. I mean, in some sense, it's one of these things that needs a lot of investment up front and has its payoff somewhere far down the line. And so it's a capital development problem. It has not yet solved everybody's problems. And quite clearly, actually, it can't solve everybody's problems. It can merely make one important component of information security, namely cryptography, serve a very wide range of functions. So that's the best understood sort of open problem in cryptography, is getting public key infrastructure to work for billions of participants as opposed to thousands. Second one I've been advertising around is that we really need a new sort of signature algorithm. If you look at the two I've mentioned, the El-Gamal signatures and RSA signatures, El-Gamal signatures are very attractive for a smart card environment. You want to sign on a smart card, verify on a server, because the signing operation is the cheap one, the one that uses the secret key, the one that needs to be bottled up in some little cheap computing device. RSA, signing is cheap, verifying is signing is cheap, signing is expensive, verifying is cheap. Now that's the characteristic you want for signed code, for example. You want to sign an operating system so people know that you have factory fresh bugs and it doesn't have viruses in it. Thank you for that laugh. That's due to a ComSec engineer at BBN named Stephen Kent. That's a great observation. You need something which the signature could be very expensive. You don't have to sign the code once. If you ran a processor for an hour to do the signature, that would be perfectly all right. What you want to be able to do is to verify the signature very quickly. There's a perennial problem, and it's currently manifests in a bunch of conferences on stream ciphers. We need, as speeds of communication go up, we need to find out what we can do that will be even faster. We can do things at billions of bits a second. Can we get them to hundreds of billions or trillions of bits a second? And after the work of last summer, there's a wide sense that hash functions need to be revisited. And that's a fairly technical issue, and I won't say anything more about it. The most essential point is that expecting crypto, we crypto marketing people really sold it very well. Right? The problem is, expecting crypto to solve all of your security problems is pretty much like thinking that, you look at big bank vaults. Well, all the big banks have vaults. Vaults are very secure these days. And that the vaults themselves don't do a lot to protect them against credit card fraud. Now, we keep building new kinds of security problems into our systems. So what do the problems look like today? Well, we're now looking for security of a diverse community. Remember, originally I talked about a rather unified community. At best, the military themselves are thinking a lot about coalition forces. Want to have security come into operation immediately when a coalition forms to fight a war. Buyers and sellers never have a unified objective. They're always at odds. They have some interests in common, but they have a lot of differences as well. So we have the thing that's big about the Internet is not that it's 25,000 miles around or whatever the Earth is, or a little farther if you stretch it out to some satellites. It's that it has millions of people, hundreds of countries, thousands of companies, a vast diversity of objectives and regulations and equipment. And it's that diversity that is characteristic of the contemporary security problem. And so that leads to the question, what does it mean relative to classical security? Who exactly is being secured? What is being secured? And in particular, whose interests are being served? And a lot of the battles being fought now about things like digital rights management, that really, security there is actually an argument between the providers and the users of information about what the arrangements for its use will be. Today, the other change is, in some sense, communication is just now one kind of computation. Oh yeah, you can expect the bits to be moved some distance, but that's likely to be dominated by the way the bits are shuffled around in the process. So even if you look as far down as something like TCP, right, most of the work of shipping it out there is computational work. Today, we're mostly concerned with violations of integrity and authenticity. In particular, if you look at most threats to confidentiality in the Internet today, they consist of somebody asking a question illegitimately, right? You call up a server, you break into a server, you fool a server, whatever, and you get it to tell you something it didn't want to tell you. Right? That's much cheaper than having a big array of antennas all around the world, the way NSA incidentally still does, but most of your opponents don't. And many people are not concerned with the national intelligence agencies. They're concerned with their competition. They're concerned with the script kiddies. They're concerned, maybe with criminals or terrorists, but they're not working against things of the same scale. And finally, if you're broken into, it's harder not to notice. Right? This has all become a dynamic process. Typically, you can recover, right? But it may cost you a lot of money. But sites go down, sites come back up. This is a very different process from the early 20th century pure communications environment. And I just put a list, that's a list of, things that happen to people, and some of them in particular, I don't know if I listed spam there, but things that are now seen as security phenomena, in some sense we wouldn't even know how to put inside the classic framework, right? Spam's sort of a violation of authentication. You're receiving a message you didn't want to receive, but certainly cryptography won't do you any good in figuring out which. It can tell you if you only listen to messages from certain people, that will solve the problem. But the fact is, to be in business, you have to be getting lots of messages from people you don't know very well. And so the response is largely at a much higher level. I call it sensorware, things that look at communication channels and pass some things and don't pass others, based on some kind of examination of content. And looking back to an earlier point, in forensics is very critical. That is to say, your site is attacked, you have recourse, right? In particular, you may want to prosecute the people who attacked it. That means you have to be keeping information so you have forensic evidence, and your security system will be designed with the legal standards and the evidence standards in mind, so that the evidence you collect will then be useful to the detectives and admissible in court. So where are we going from here? Well, I think the thing that characterizes All of this development is increasing automation. It started out with the simple matter of automating the cryptographic systems. It comes now to a matter of the computers do more and more computing relative to each time a human being considers the matter. And so you have much more autonomy among the computers. Today, I think you sort of know where your computation is happening. That is to say, some of it's in your laptop or on your desktop. Some of it's in a server room whose location may not be known to you, but you know that your organization owns it, or you know it's being contracted out. And some of it's in places like Google and eBay and Amazon, and you know what organization is doing it. You don't know exactly, where they are, and you surely don't know, or I don't know, and exactly what they're doing you don't know, but they're getting something done for you. But you tend to initiate that. You initiate a contact with Google, for example. I believe that in the fairly near future, the web services vision is going to come to fruition. And that means that your computer will very frequently be going outside of itself for specialized computations without consulting you. And as time goes on, that will come to be the majority of any real computation. Just the way today, if you look at any big contract, you have a contract, I don't know, for, food services or for an airplane or for transport or something, in the end, hundreds of subcontractors will be involved. And it takes an audit to find out who all of them are. But all of this will be happening in seconds, not days or weeks or months. And so the problems that are going to come up to dominate the early 21st century in computing are going to have to do with negotiation and with configuration control and with automated adjudication of these kinds of things. So I think that, the bottom line is that the security measures of the future are going to look a good deal more like human security measures than the ones we've seen in the past. I'm going to finish awkwardly. I meant to show off this equipment earlier on, but since I have it, I might as well get back to it. I should have done it right after Diffie-Hellman. These are both devices. They're both public key devices. That one's the one that started the key escrow fight. This is the AT&T TSD 3600. It could have been a wonderful thing. I mean, only 20,000 of them or so were made in the end, which for AT&T counts as a failure. It is a device that plugs in between the handset and the phone, and you push a button, and it gives you a secure connection from end to end. Having used this and its relatives for 10 years, I can tell you this involves no public key infrastructure. It's totally anonymous. What it displays on its display is a very technical, I call it the key identifier, I don't know what they call it. And they're only usable by dedicated gooks, right? Geeks, we're geeks, that's it. This is a very different kind of object. This is an X25 packet encryptor. This is the best thing I did for Northern Telecom. This is a device that distinguishes two stages of security we called station-to-station security and person-to-person security, following terminology of phone calls. And it has a very elaborate sort of three-phase protocol that negotiates keys, and it's what introduced a notion called forward secrecy, which means that if all the keys were known at some point, nonetheless people won't be able to read the future communications. So, and it's also very heavy. You could hit somebody with it if you needed to. I think that's it. Thank you all very much.
My name is Dick Gerton. I'm a volunteer at the museum. And my question is this. When you and Martin Hellman published your work and presented the work, I heard that the NSA came after you basically for having given away a system that they could not break. Is this a fabrication or is it the truth?
I think it's a vast exaggeration. I've had rather good relationships with NSA. Nobody has ever threatened me. I mean, I can't say, at times people have been rude. But I've been rude at times too. We haven't, and so no, I would say nothing like that happened. Now, there are people who perceive things very differently. And the man who died, what's his name? The man who died in the last year or so, filed a patent about 1980 on a voice scrambler, and they put a patent secrecy order on it. And he got in a big fight with them, and he claimed that they threatened him. I don't know. But I think that unquestionably they were very, very unhappy. And what I was told much later was that if I thought that New Directions had raised a stir in the public world, I should have been around to see the stir that it raised when that issue of the transactions on information theory arrived at NSA. Because they thought of cryptography as their personal property. And put it, unmodestly, that was the first. There had been a few lousy papers published on cryptography, but I think ours was one of the very first that laid it solidly on the line and did good work. There was another paper on the same issue by a man named Key from MITRE that was very good work. So.
My name is Leo Brookes, and I'm known by IOCCC. My question is, you haven't mentioned the storage security at all.
I haven't mentioned storage security.
Right, like problems like storage anonymity, proof of ownership, etc.
Oh gosh, I guess that's because it isn't a general lecture on security. Briefly, in my view, what dominates storage security is the same thing that are called escrow considerations or key recovery. If you encrypt a communication, then the keys are worth something. Doctrine is that information in communication is not worth anything. Right? If it doesn't arrive at the other end, you ask for a retransmission, and you get a retransmission. And so the keys that protect it are not worth anything either. I mean, if you lose keys, you can't read communications. You have to expense to go through a rekeying operation, and then you transmit again. If you encrypt something and store it, right, and allow it to be on any backup tape anywhere in the world and so forth, I mean, you depend on the cryptography for the security of storage, then you must have robust means for getting your hands on the keys, or you're going to lose the data. And so it's a different problem. It's not adequately, we're working on that. I'm sure other people are working on that. It is not adequately represented in contemporary storage systems.
Right. I see that part of the magic of the Diffie-Hellman algorithm is that the two endpoints, in this case two, don't need to have any knowledge a priori of each other with the certain exception of the generator and so forth. Are there any other algorithms that assume no shared secret, nothing that is known a priori?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can always just negotiate all those things at the beginning. I mean, you could use RSA the same way. I mean, for computational cost reasons, it's not a good thing to do, but some Raycal-Milgo equipment used RSA ephemerally. That is to say, they manufactured brand new RSA keys for communications. And, I sent you the public component and you sent me the public component of yours. It's the same thing. It's merely that Diffie-Hellman is a much less expensive way of manufacturing ephemeral keying material than RSA or than any of the other systems that are known.
And it's less expensive because it's just exchange of the public numbers rather than the certificates themselves.
No, it's because it's the exchange of two things that are just numbers. With very broad belief that all the x's, with the exception of 0 and 1, or some roughly, right, all the x's and y's are fine. So it's just the cost of generating a random number. Generating an RSA number is a matter of manufacturing a pair of primes and doing a lot of tests and so forth. So you're talking about, a few hundred computations versus a few 100,000 computations, something like that.
Two quick ones I hope for you. One of them is in PGP, both Diffie-Hellman and RSA keys are optioned. Could you speak a little bit about their relative real-life performance in PGP? And the second,
gosh, no, I'm sorry. Get Zimmerman down here. I have no idea how well either of them works. I mean, I think he originally built it with RSA. He put in Diffie-Hellman because he got mad at Jim Bidzos. And
Yeah.
I don't know what the performance analyses show. I would have said RSA is, generally speaking, better adapted to email-type problems, but that doesn't mean you can certainly use Diffie-Hellman, El-Gamal sort of techniques quite well.
Great, thanks.
I thought that was two questions. That one sounds like one.
The second one is another PGP
Second is
oriented
like
question.
oh, I see. If I didn't know the answer to the first one, I won't know the answer to the second.
I'll ask it anyway. Well, are you familiar with what they call their enterprise system? And it presents a problem that may be interesting beyond whether they really can achieve what they claim. It's a server that sits on it sits on the mail link for an organization and enforces encrypted mail in both directions, supposedly.
Yeah, so it's done by proxying. In some sense, that's already built. IP recognizes a military, it's not advertised this way, but there's a military concept called a crypto guard. And a crypto guard is a command that handles the cryptography for some unit that doesn't have what's called organic cryptographic capability. This all dates back years when it was very expensive. That's the same thing. You're basically putting something out there as a proxy. You can put it in the firewall or somewhere like that. And I think lots of things do that. I don't think that, there's anything terribly strange about that concept. And if you have to analyze, it protects you against some phenomena and not against others.
So it ought to be workable in practice.
I don't see why not.
Thanks.
Just a quick question. Roughly what percentage of your own personal email do you encrypt?
Oh gosh, I'm not currently doing any of it. I went through a long period of that. What happened? I ought to pick it up again. You know what happened? Is that I only been using a laptop now for about a year or two. I moved slowly. And when I was at Northern, there was a period I did a lot of encrypted email, and I had this setup that had a PC that, so to speak, was really mine. I had real control over it, connected to a Sun workstation, which was on a network, and I would say, roughly speaking, I didn't trust. I got to Sun, I had no PC, I just had Sun workstations, and it seemed to me the security model associated with PGP really, didn't do me enough good, so I haven't done a lot of it. I did do a burst of it in the mid-90s, but I apologize, I'm not a big enough secure email freak. I do a lot of secure telephone. I like secure telephones. My joke about secure telephones is the problem with them is there are more types of secure telephones than there are secure telephones. Now, that isn't quite true, but at one point I had 4 different types on my desk. 2 of those AT&T ones, a Stew 3 and another thing produced by a guy named Eric Blossom. He's had a couple of company names. I can't remember the name of that one. And I'm down to the Stew 3 and the Blossom phone.
Obviously, I could say my name's David Yardrum, and we know one another because I'm stuck with the Blossom Phone Company. This will indicate just how bad my life is these days. A couple of days ago, there was a physicist on C-SPAN speaking to quantum computing, and he said one of the applications for it as it emerged is it would allow people to examine all of those historically encrypted emails. Do you have a comment in that area?
Yeah, I think it's probably true. I think sorry to get in John's attempt to retire this. No, there's a lot to be said on this subject. I didn't give another thing I didn't lecture on tonight. There'll be lots of fun to talk about is signals intelligence. And the critical thing about signals intelligence is that, one, nothing ever goes away, right? There are thousands of people in the world today making up code books. Right? There are always large backlogs of traffic, and there's value to studying past traffic, sometimes at quite a distance. The most famous piece of it is the Venona traffic of the Soviet Union. Traffic sent in the early 1940s. The project closed in 1978. So I can guarantee you that DES traffic, RSA traffic, all sorts of traffic that has been sent in the last 50 years or more will come under the scrutiny of the quantum computing if quantum computing flowers. And exactly what the impacts of that will be is not clear. But it's one of the interesting things about the future of intelligence. Thank you all very much.